June 28th, 1967, 10:47 a.m. A newspaper sits untouched on a doorstep on Britannia Road in Bristol, England. The neighbor walking past has seen Louisa at this door 1,000 times, standing in her black velvet coat, waving, chatting about the weather. But this morning, something's wrong. The window, Louisa never leaves her windows open. Never. The neighbor knocks, no answer. She tries the door, unlocked. Inside, the front room is too quiet, too still, and then she sees it. A tiny frame on the floor, 5'3", less than 100 pounds, 75 years old. Louisa Dunn's body lies motionless, her black velvet coat hanging unused by the door where it should have kept her warm. The postmortem reveals what the neighbor couldn't see: strangulation, rape. A palm print on the window framed the killer's signature, left behind in the place where he entered and where he escaped. Within hours, 91 police officers flood Britannia Road. They will knock on 8,000 doors, take 2,000 formal statements, fingerprint nearly 20,000 men, every male between 15 and 60 within a 1.5-mile radius. They will collect palm prints until their hands cramp. They will chase every lead until the trail goes cold. But they will never find him. The palm print sits in an evidence box, waiting. The killer walks free, living his life, raising his children, committing more crimes. He thinks he's won. He thinks he's beaten them. He has no idea that 57 years later, a single piece of fabric will bring his entire world crashing down. This is the longest cold case ever solved in the United Kingdom. And the man who committed this crime, he just became the oldest person ever convicted of murder in British history. At 92 years old, he finally heard the words he thought he'd escaped: "You will die in prison." If you're fascinated by cold cases that took decades to solve, cases where justice seemed impossible until science and determination proved everyone wrong, hit that subscribe button right now. This is a story about DNA evidence that sat in a box for over half a century, about a palm print that meant nothing until technology caught up, about a killer who thought time was his ally. What happened in 2024 that finally broke this case wide open? Stay with me. And I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. Bristol, England, 1967. The eastern area of the city where Britannia Road cuts through rows of terraced houses, all pressed together like books on a shelf. This is the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows everyone, where Mrs. Henderson waters her roses every morning at 8, where Mr. Phillips walks his terrier past the same lamppost at 6:30, where Louisa Dunn stands by her front door in her black velvet coat, watching the world go by, chatting with neighbors about the price of milk and the weather forecast, where elderly women walk to the corner shop alone without a second thought, because nothing bad happens here. Not really. Not to people like us. The summer of 1967 is ordinary. Britain is caught up in Beatlemania and Mary Quant's miniskirts. The Six-Day War has just ended in the Middle East. But on Britannia Road, life moves slower. Louisa makes her daily trips to the shops, her tiny frame wrapped in that distinctive black coat. Neighbors wave, she waves back. "Good morning, love. Lovely day, isn't it? See you tomorrow." Except tomorrow, they won't see her at all. I need you to comment the exact time you're watching this right now. I need to see how many of you are discovering this case past midnight, when the streets are as quiet as they were on Britannia Road that night in 1967. Then drop your location below. And if you've ever been to Bristol, England, or if you're watching from there right now, I need you to comment, "I know this place." The reason why will become clear in the next few minutes, and it's going to completely change how you think about cold cases and the passage of time. Louisa Jane Jarrett was born in 1892, Gloucester, England. By 1967, she had lived 75 years, long enough to see 2 world wars: the rise and fall of the British Empire, and the transformation of Bristol from an industrial port city to something modern and unrecognizable. But her life hadn't been easy. She married Edwin Teddy Parker in 1915. They had 2 daughters, Edna and Iris, and built a life in Bristol filled with political activism and community involvement. They were Labour Party members, deeply engaged in local government. Teddy was a city alderman in the 1930s. Everyone said he'd be mayor someday. Everyone was wrong. He died in 1945, just as his political career was taking off, leaving Louisa a widow with 2 young women to raise alone. The woman who had once hosted lively political discussions in her parlor slowly withdrew from public life. The light went out of her. But she carried on, because that's what strong women did in 1945. You carried on. She remarried in 1952 to John Dunn, a night watchman. Her name changed for the final time, Louisa Dunn. For 9 years, she had companionship again. Then John died in 1961, and Louisa was widowed for a second time. The years after John's death were the hardest. She became reclusive. Her health deteriorated. Standing just 5'3" and weighing less than 100 pounds, she looked frail, breakable. Her daughters, Edna and Iris, became estranged from her. The family would later attribute this to Louisa's alleged heavy drinking, a way to cope with grief that instead drove everyone away. But the neighbors on Britannia Road, they saw something different. They saw a kind woman who wouldn't hurt a fly. They saw her standing at her door, wrapped in her black velvet coat, ready with a smile and a wave. They saw her walking to the shops, always at the same time, following the same route. They saw her at her friend Alice Clark's house, sharing custard and stewed gooseberry, saying the same goodbye she always said, "Good night, God bless. I don't know when I'll be seeing thee." On June 27th, 1967, she said those words for the last time. She had no idea she'd just spent her final evening alive. She had no idea that someone was watching her walk home. Someone who saw her not as a neighbor, not as a person, but as prey. June 27th, 1967. Evening settles over Bristol like a curtain falling. Louisa leaves Alice Clark's house around 8 p.m., walking the familiar path back to Britannia Road. It's summer, so the sun is only just setting. There are people on the streets, neighbors sitting on their steps, enjoying the warm air. Children playing one last game before bedtime. Louisa walks past them all in her black velvet coat, too warm for summer, but she always wears it. It's familiar, safe. She reaches her home, unlocks the door, steps inside. Somewhere nearby, Ryland Hedley is watching. He's 35 years old. Born in the West Indies in 1932, he immigrated to England in 1952, the same year Louisa married John Dunn. By 1958, he was living in Bristol. He has a wife, 3 children. He lives on Picton Street, just 1.6 miles from Britannia Road. Close enough to know the neighborhood, far enough that Louisa has never noticed him before. He looks ordinary. That's the thing about monsters. They rarely look the part. They don't wear signs around their necks. They blend in. They smile at neighbors. They go to work. They kiss their wives goodbye in the morning. And then they do unspeakable things. Hedley has been trolling the streets of Bristol, looking, hunting. He's found what he's looking for, an elderly woman who lives alone, a woman whose house he's watched long enough to know her routine, a woman vulnerable enough to overpower, a woman no one will hear scream. Louisa goes about her evening. She's exhausted from the walk back from Alice's house. Her joints ache. She's 75 years old, and every year feels heavier than the last. She makes her way to the front room, probably thinking about tomorrow, about her walk to the shops, about whether Alice's gooseberries were as good as last year's batch. She doesn't notice the window, the one she always keeps closed, the one that's now slightly ajar. Hedley has already been inside. The palm print on the window frame will later tell investigators exactly where he entered and exited. But right now, in this moment, Louisa has no idea she's not alone. No idea that in the next few minutes, her life will end in the most brutal way imaginable. Neighbors later tell police they heard a woman scream that night, then muffled cries. But they couldn't determine where the sounds came from. The terrace houses on Britannia Road amplify noise, bouncing it off brick walls until you can't tell if it's coming from next door or 3 houses down. So they did what people do. They assumed it wasn't their business. They assumed someone else would check. They assumed it was probably nothing. By the time the sun rises on June 28th, Louisa Dunn is dead, strangled, raped, left on the floor of her front room like discarded trash. And Ryland Hedley has walked out through that same window, leaving his palm print behind like a signature he thinks no one will ever read. But here's what nobody knew, including Hedley himself. That palm print was about to trigger the largest fingerprinting operation in Bristol's history. And 57 years later, it would be the second piece of evidence that sent him to prison for life. June 28th, 1967, morning. The newspaper sits on Louisa's doorstep, untouched. This is wrong. Louisa always collects her newspaper. Always. The neighbor notices, and then she notices the window, open. Louisa never leaves windows open. She's particular about that. It's one of her quirks, windows closed, doors locked at night. A habit from living alone, from being vulnerable, from understanding that the world isn't always safe for elderly women in empty houses. The neighbor knocks. No answer. She tries again. Nothing. The door is unlocked. She pushes it open. Louisa, love, are you all right? The smell hits her first. Not strong yet, but present. That sweet, wrong smell that makes your brain scream danger before you understand why. She steps into the front room, and there she is. Louisa Dunn, 5'3", less than 100 pounds, 75 years old, on the floor, her black velvet coat hanging by the door, as if she'd just taken it off, as if she'd had plans to put it back on tomorrow. The neighbor runs outside, screaming. Within minutes, Britannia Road erupts. Police cars, ambulances, investigators. The postmortem will confirm what everyone already knows: this was murder. But it will also reveal something worse: strangulation, sexual assault. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was targeted, predatory, calculated. The investigation that follows is massive. 91 police officers are assigned to the case. They go door to door to more than 8,000 houses. They take over 2,000 formal statements. They are determined to find who did this to Louisa Dunn. And then they find the palm print. On the window frame, exactly where the killer entered and exited, is a perfect impression. A palm print. Not a fingerprint. Those are easy to find and compare. A palm print. Larger, more distinctive, and absolutely useless if you don't have a match. The police make a decision. They will fingerprint every man between the ages of 15 and 60 who lives within a 1.5 mile radius of Britannia Road. Every single one. They will also fingerprint anyone with prior convictions for burglary or sexual offenses within a wider area. They will leave no stone unturned. Nearly 20,000 men line up to have their palm prints taken. 20,000. Imagine the logistics, the time, the manpower, the sheer determination to find justice for one 75-year-old woman who lived alone and walked to the shops in a black velvet coat. The police compare each print to the one from Louisa's window. They're looking for a match. One print, one name, one arrest that will bring closure to a community that no longer feels safe. They don't find it. Print after print, man after man, house after house, no match. The killer's palm print sits in the evidence file, taunting investigators. It's right there, clear, perfect. But without a match, it's worthless. The case goes cold. Not immediately. For months, investigators chase leads. They re-interview witnesses. They expand the search radius, but with no match to the palm print, no witnesses who saw anything useful, and no physical evidence connecting anyone to the crime, the trail grows colder and colder until it disappears entirely. By 1961, the investigation is effectively over. Louisa Dunn's murder becomes another unsolved case. Another file in a box. Another elderly woman whose killer got away with it. But what happened next would prove everyone wrong. Because that palm print wasn't useless. That fabric evidence carefully preserved in storage wasn't forgotten. And the man who walked away from Britannia Road thinking he'd gotten away with murder, he had no idea the clock was still ticking. Ryland Hedley goes home. He goes back to Picton Street, 1.6 miles from the crime scene. He goes back to his wife and his 3 children. He goes back to his ordinary life, and he thinks he's won. But here's what makes this case so chilling. Hedley doesn't stop. In October 1977, 10 years after Louisa Dunn's murder, Hedley strikes again, this time in Ipswich. He rapes 2 women, ages 79 and 84, inside their homes. The pattern is identical. Elderly women, living alone, attacked in their own houses. He threatens to kill at least one of them. The police in Ipswich don't connect it to Bristol. Why would they? That case is 10 years old and 2 cities away. They launch their own investigation. They fingerprint over 5,000 men living in the area, looking for a match to prints found at these crime scenes. They find one. Ryland Hedley. He pleads guilty. The evidence is overwhelming. He's sentenced to life in prison. Finally, justice. Right? Wrong. Hedley appeals. And in court, doctors present a defense that would be laughable if it weren't so horrifying. They blame his crimes on sexual frustration. They say his wife was ambitious and demanding. They say this made him do it, made him break into elderly women's homes, made him rape them, made him threaten their lives. The court accepts this excuse. Ryland Hedley is released after serving just 2 years in prison. 2 years for raping 2 elderly women in their own homes. 2 years for crimes that mirror exactly what he did to Louisa Dunn a decade earlier. He walks free in 1979. He moves back to Ipswich. He lives his life, gets older, becomes a grandfather, watches the years tick by, each one distancing him further from his crimes, each one making it less likely anyone will connect the dots. By 2012, he's 80 years old. Police question him about an assault. They want to take his palm print. He refuses, says he has arthritis, says his hands hurt too much. The police believe him. They don't push it. They let him go. Did he refuse because of arthritis? Or did he refuse because he knew somewhere in the back of his mind that his palm print from 1967 was still sitting in an evidence box in Bristol? That if anyone ever compared them, his entire life would collapse? We'll never know what he was thinking. But what we do know is this. When police finally did take his palm print in 2024, there were no issues. No arthritis preventing the process. No pain, no difficulty. He lied. And that lie bought him 12 more years of freedom. Meanwhile, in Bristol, Louisa Dunn's case sat cold. Her granddaughter, Mary Dayton, grew up not asking questions. The family didn't talk about it. Mary's mother, Edna Louisa's daughter, had a nervous breakdown after the murder and never fully recovered. The family fell apart, and the community that once supported them withdrew. Because there's a stigma, Mary would later say, attached to rape and murder. People didn't want to be associated with it, didn't want to get too close to that kind of tragedy. So Louisa's murder became a family secret, a wound that never healed, a case that everyone assumed would never be solved. But in 2023, Detective Joanne Smith of Avon and Somerset Police's Major and Statutory Crime Review Team pulled Louisa's case from the archives. She was relieved to find that multiple boxes of files and evidence were still available, even after more than 50 years. Even after storage purges and office moves and technological changes, everything was still there, including the skirt Louisa had been wearing the night she died. Detective Smith understands something crucial about sexual assault cases. Semen is often well preserved on fabric, even after decades, even after 50+ years in storage. If Louisa's skirt had been properly preserved, and if semen had been present, there might be enough DNA to develop a profile. It's a long shot. DNA technology in 1967 was non-existent. The swabs taken from Louisa's body confirmed the presence of semen, but that information was useless without the ability to extract and analyze DNA. The evidence sat in storage, waiting for science to catch up. By 2023, science had caught up. Detective Smith sends the skirt to the forensic lab. The technicians extract DNA, they develop a profile, and then they run it through the National Criminal Database. Match found, Ryland Hedley. The system flagged him because his DNA had been entered into the database in 2012 when police questioned him about that assault. The same incident where he refused to provide a palm print because of arthritis. His DNA was in the system the whole time, just waiting, just sitting there like a ticking time bomb. But here's what makes this revelation even more devastating. Hedley had lived just 1/10 of a mile outside the search radius, where police collected palm prints from every man in 1967. 1/10 of a mile. If the radius had been just slightly larger, if investigators had decided to extend the search area by a few hundred feet, they would have knocked on his door. They would have taken his palm print. They would have matched it to the print on Louisa's window frame. They would have arrested him in 1967, before the 1977 rapes. Before 2 more elderly women were terrorized in their homes. Before 57 years of freedom he didn't deserve. 1/10 of a mile. Detective Smith now has DNA evidence linking Hedley to Louisa's murder. But she wants more. She wants the palm print match. Because that palm print has been sitting in evidence for 57 years. And if it matches Hedley's, it proves he was at the scene. It proves physical contact with the window frame. It corroborates the DNA evidence beyond any reasonable doubt. On November 19th, 2024, police arrive at Ryland Hedley's home on Clarence Road in Ipswich. He's 92 years old now. An old man living out his final years in comfort, probably thinking he got away with it, probably believing that after 57 years, the past was buried for good. They arrest him for the rape and murder of Louisa Dunn. They take him into custody, and this time, when they ask for his palm print, he has no choice but to comply. It matches perfectly. The print on Louisa's window frame and Ryland Hedley's palm print are identical. Not similar, identical. He's charged with rape and murder. After a hearing on November 21st, 2024, he's remanded to custody. His trial is set for the following summer. The case that everyone thought was unsolved, the cold case that haunted Bristol for nearly 6 decades, is about to be closed. But the story you've heard so far, that's just the beginning. Because what happened in that courtroom would expose not just one man's evil, but a justice system that failed Louisa Dunn and countless other victims. And the evidence presented at trial would reveal details about Hedley's crimes that were so disturbing, even seasoned investigators had to step out of the room. The trial begins on June 16th, 2025. Ryland Hedley is 92 years old. He walks into court assisted by a cane. He looks frail, elderly, harmless. But the prosecution is about to dismantle that image piece by piece. The DNA evidence comes first. The forensic expert explains how DNA was extracted from the skirt Louisa wore the night she died, how a profile was developed, how that profile matched Ryland Hedley's DNA in the criminal database, with a probability so high that it's statistically impossible for it to be anyone else. 1 in several billion. The defense tries to argue contamination. They suggest the evidence was mishandled, that 57 years in storage could have compromised the sample. But the prosecution shows that the skirt was properly preserved in sealed evidence bags, stored in climate-controlled conditions, and handled with forensic protocols that prevent contamination. The DNA is solid, unshakable. Then comes the palm print. The forensic analyst displays side-by-side images for the jury. On the fasted left, the palm print lifted from Louisa's window frame in 1967. On the right, Ryland Hedley's palm print, taken in 2024. The ridge patterns match at 17 points of comparison. In the UK, 12 points are sufficient for a positive identification. This is 17. The defense has no response to this. You can't fake a palm print. You can't contaminate a palm print. It's either a match or it's not, and this is a match. But here's what makes the evidence even more damning. The prosecution brings in the 1977 case. The 2 elderly women in Ipswich. The pattern is identical. Home invasion, elderly victims, sexual assault, threats of violence. The modus operandi is a perfect match to Louisa's murder. The jury learns that Hedley served only 2 years for those crimes. 2 years for raping 2 women in their 80s. The defense had blamed his wife, had said she was too demanding, had convinced the court that this somehow excused his actions. The prosecutor lets that sit with the jury. 2 years for 2 rapes. And now, decades later, they're learning he committed a third attack, a murder that he got away with for 57 years. Because of the passage of time, most witnesses are dead. But their 1967 statements are read in court. 2 of Louisa's neighbors had reported hearing a woman scream that night, followed by muffled cries. They couldn't determine where the sounds came from. But now, with hindsight, with evidence, with context, the jury knows exactly where those screams came from. They came from Louisa's front room. As Hedley strangled her, as she fought for her life, as 75 years of existence ended in terror and pain, the timeline is laid out minute by minute. Louisa leaving Alice Clark's house at 8 p.m., the walk home, the killer entering through the window, the attack, the murder, the escape. All of it corroborated by evidence, by witness statements, by forensic analysis. That took 57 years to finally piece together. And then the prosecution drops the final piece of evidence. Electoral roll records show that in 1967, Ryland Hedley lived on Picton Street in Bristol, exactly 1.6 miles from Britannia Road, just 1/10 of a mile outside the radius where police took palm prints from every man. Close enough to know the neighborhood, far enough to slip through the net. The defense argues he was just unlucky. Wrong place, wrong time. DNA and palm prints don't prove he killed Louisa. Maybe he knew her. Maybe he visited her house for innocent reasons. The prosecution destroys this argument in seconds. Louisa's family testifies they never knew Hedley, never heard his name, never saw him at her house. Neighbors say the same. No one recognized him. No one could place him anywhere near Louisa except through his palm print on her window frame and his DNA on her clothing. The defense has nothing. No alibi, no explanation, no reasonable doubt. Just a 92-year-old man sitting in court, finally facing consequences 57 years too late. Look at what Ryland Hedley did. Look at how he targeted vulnerable elderly women. Look at how he walked free for decades while Louisa's family fell apart, while her daughter had a nervous breakdown, while her granddaughter grew up never knowing justice was possible. And here's the worst part. He almost got away with it forever. 1/10 of a mile saved him in 1967. A refused palm print in 2012 bought him more years of freedom. If you can't stand people like this, if you believe that elderly women deserve to live without fear in their own homes, hit subscribe right now. Let Ryland Hedley know that his victims are not forgotten. Only predators and those who defend them will scroll past this. Only people who think 2 years in prison for 2 rapes is somehow acceptable. Only people who believe that because someone is old, justice doesn't matter. Prove you're better than that. Prove you believe Louisa Dunn's life mattered. Subscribe and comment justice for Louisa below. Show the world that we don't forget. That we don't let age or time erase accountability. That we stand with victims, not with monsters. But here's what the prosecution reveals next, something that makes this entire case even more disturbing. Remember when Hedley refused to give his palm print in 2012, when he claimed arthritis made it too painful? Investigators now believe he lied because he knew his palm print would match the one from 1967. But how would he know that unless he remembered leaving it? This means Hedley likely spent 57 years knowing he'd left evidence behind, living with the fear that one day someone would knock on his door, that one day science would catch up, that one day the palm print would matter. And yet he did nothing to leave the country, nothing to change his identity, nothing to distance himself from the crime. He just lived his life, raised his children, became a grandfather, walked the streets of Ipswich freely because he thought time was on his side. The prosecution presents evidence that Hedley may have heard about the massive fingerprinting operation in Bristol in 1967. Living just outside the search radius, he would have known investigators were going door to door. He would have known they were taking palm prints. He would have wondered if they'd reach him. When they didn't, he breathed easier. Each day that passed, each week, each month, the odds of getting caught decreased. By 1970, the case was cold. By 1980, it was ancient history. By 2000, everyone involved in the original investigation was retired or dead. He was safe, except he wasn't. Because in 2012, when police questioned him about that assault, they wanted his DNA and his palm print. He gave DNA, probably figuring that without a conviction for Louisa's murder, his DNA wouldn't be in any database connected to it. But the palm print, that scared him, because he knew that palm print on Louisa's window had never been matched. If anyone ever compared them, he was done. So he lied about arthritis. And it worked for 12 more years. The jury hears all of this. They see a man who didn't just commit murder, they see a man who spent nearly 6 decades evading consequences, who committed more crimes, who lied to police, who lived free while his victims' families suffered. The prosecution's closing argument is devastating. They remind the jury of every piece of evidence: the DNA, the palm print, the pattern of behavior, the 1977 convictions, the lies, the 57 years of freedom Hedley enjoyed while Louisa's granddaughter Mary grew up in a family destroyed by his actions. They remind the jury that Louisa was 5'3" and weighed less than 100 pounds, that she was 75 years old, that she was strangled and raped in her own home, the one place she should have been safe, that she died alone and terrified because Ryland Hedley decided her life meant nothing. The defense tries to create sympathy for Hedley. He's 92 years old, they say. He's frail. He's at the end of his life. Is there really a point to conviction now, after all these years? The prosecution responds with Mary Dayton's words. When people asked why police were wasting time and money on such an old case, Mary said this: "This is the worst crime you can commit. Rape and murder are horrendous. Are you saying that because somebody is old and because it's been this amount of time between when it happened and when they finally found out who it was, justice doesn't have to be done? We have laws. We have punishments. And if they aren't followed through and pursued as best we can, then there's absolutely no point in having laws." The jury deliberates. The wait is agonizing for Mary Dayton, who sits in the courtroom, now 78 years old, 3 years older than her grandmother was when she died. She's the only family member who survived long enough to see this trial. Her mother Edna is dead. Her aunt Iris is dead. Almost everyone who knew Louisa personally is gone, but Mary is here, and she's waiting. On June 30th, 2025, 58 years to the day after Louisa's body was discovered, the jury returns. They've reached a verdict: guilty, on both counts, rape and murder. Ryland Hedley shows no emotion. He sits in his chair, staring straight ahead as the verdict is read. Does he feel regret, remorse, or just anger that he finally got caught? We'll never know, because he doesn't speak, doesn't apologize, doesn't explain. He just sits there, a 92-year-old man who murdered a 75-year-old woman 58 years ago and thought time would save him. It didn't. July 1st, 2025, sentencing day. Justice Derek Sweeting presides over a courtroom packed with media, true crime followers, and the few remaining people who remember Louisa Dunn personally. Mary Dayton sits in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together. Justice Sweeting addresses the court. He outlines the severity of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, the brutality of the attack, the decades of suffering inflicted on Louisa's family, the fact that Hedley committed similar crimes in 1977 and served only 2 years, the lies he told to avoid accountability. Then he addresses Hedley directly. You targeted a vulnerable elderly woman in her own home. You showed no mercy, no remorse. You left her family to suffer for 58 years without answers, without closure, without justice. You went on to commit more crimes against elderly women. You were given a second chance when you were released after just 2 years in prison. You wasted it. You continued to evade justice through lies and geographical luck. The sentence, life in prison. In UK law, a life sentence requires the judge to set a minimum term, the length of time before the prisoner can be considered for parole. Justice Sweeting sets this at 20 years. 20 years for a 92-year-old man. Then, Justice Sweeting says something that will echo through every cold case investigation in the UK.
It is normally necessary to explain the effect of such a minimum term in detail, but given your age, and for all practical purposes, I can do so in very short terms. You will never be released. You will die in prison. You can go down.
The courtroom is silent. Hedley is led away. No dramatics, no outburst. Just an old man shuffling out of the courtroom, knowing he'll never leave prison alive. Mary Dayton releases a statement outside the courthouse. She thanks Detective Joanne Smith and the entire investigation team. She talks about her grandmother not as a murder victim, but as a person. A woman who lost 2 husbands, who struggled with grief and loneliness, who loved gooseberry, custard, and wore a black velvet coat, who stood at her door chatting with neighbors because human connection mattered to her. My grandmother was a person, Mary says. She wasn't just a case number. She wasn't just an unsolved murder. She was Louisa. And she deserved better than what happened to her. But she also deserved justice. And today, finally, she got it. The media coverage is massive. The case makes headlines worldwide. The oldest cold case ever solved in the United Kingdom, the oldest person ever convicted of murder in British history. A 58-year journey from crime to conviction. But the statistics, while impressive, miss the point. This isn't about records. This isn't about age. This is about accountability. About a justice system that refused to let time erase a crime. About investigators who kept evidence preserved for over half a century. About technology that finally caught up with evil. About a granddaughter who lived long enough to see her grandmother's murderer face consequences. Hedley will die in prison. It's not the decades behind bars that most murderers face. It's not the full weight of justice that Louisa's family deserved. But it's something. It's accountability. It's a conviction. It's proof that even 58 years later, truth matters. The case also raises uncomfortable questions about the 1977 convictions. If Hedley had been properly sentenced for raping those 2 elderly women, if he'd served a full life sentence instead of 2 years, would investigators have eventually connected him to Louisa's murder? Would the palm print comparison have happened sooner? Would those 12 years between 2012 and 2024, when he lived free because he lied about arthritis, have been prevented? The answer is probably yes. The system failed not just Louisa, but those 2 women in Ipswich. The defense that blamed his wife for his crimes, that accepted sexual frustration as a mitigating factor, was a failure of justice so profound it enabled a murderer to walk free. Even with a conviction, questions remain, and they probably always will. How many other victims are there? Hedley attacked elderly women in Bristol in 1967 and in Ipswich in 1977. That's a 10-year gap. What happened in those 10 years? What happened in the years after 1979 when he was released? Did he stop, or did he just not get caught? Investigators have looked for unsolved cases with similar patterns: home invasions, targeting elderly women, sexual assaults, strangulation. They haven't found clear matches, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that without DNA or palm print evidence connecting Hedley to other crimes, conviction is impossible. Why did he refuse the palm print in 2012, but not the DNA? This suggests he knew the palm print was dangerous, but didn't think DNA would connect him to anything. Was this because he didn't understand DNA technology? Or because he thought the DNA evidence from 1967 had been destroyed or degraded? What was going through his mind during those 57 years? Did he think about Louisa Dunn? Did he remember her screams? Or had he compartmentalized it so thoroughly that it became just another forgotten night in a long life? We'll never know. Hedley hasn't spoken about the crime, hasn't explained himself, hasn't apologized. He pleaded not guilty and maintained that stance through the trial. Even after conviction, he's remained silent. This silence is its own kind of cruelty. Mary Dayton will never get answers to the questions that haunt her. Why her grandmother? What happened in those final moments? Did Louisa suffer? Was she conscious at the end? The forensic evidence can tell us some things, but it can't tell us everything. And Hedley, the only person who could fill in those gaps, has chosen silence. Ryland Hedley wanted to be forgotten. He wanted Louisa's murder to fade into history. He wanted to die peacefully in his home, surrounded by his family, having gotten away with murder for 58 years. He wanted his victims' names erased while his own remained clean. If you believe Louisa Dunn mattered, if you believe we must remember so this never happens again, hit that like button and subscribe right now. People like Hedley depend on our silence, our short attention spans, our willingness to say it happened so long ago. Why does it matter now? It matters because every life matters. It matters because justice isn't optional. It matters because if we let time erase accountability, we tell predators that all they have to do is wait. Like this video if you believe that. Subscribe if you believe that elderly people deserve safety, dignity, and justice, regardless of how much time has passed. Comment "Every victim matters" below. Only those who side with predators, only those who think 2 years for 2 rapes is somehow acceptable will refuse. Don't be like them. Don't be silent. Engage right now. This case changed UK cold case investigation forever. It proved that no case is too old, that no evidence is too degraded, that advances in DNA technology can reach back decades and solve crimes that everyone assumed were unsolved forever. Detective Joanne Smith's decision to revisit this case in 2023 was based on hope and determination. She knew the odds were low. She knew that even with preserved evidence, DNA extraction after 56 years was far from guaranteed. But she tried anyway, because Louisa Dunn deserved someone to try. The preservation of evidence was crucial. In many cold cases, evidence is destroyed after a certain period. Storage space is limited. Budgets are tight. Evidence from unsolved cases, decades old, is often purged to make room for newer investigations. But Bristol kept Louisa's evidence. Every box, every file, every piece of fabric. And that decision to preserve rather than destroy made justice possible. This case also highlights the importance of national DNA databases. Hedley's DNA entered the system in 2012 when police questioned him about an assault. Without that database, the DNA from Louisa's skirt would have been useless. You can't match DNA to a person who isn't in the system. The UK's decision to maintain comprehensive databases controversial as they are directly led to this conviction. Mary Dayton is 78 years old now. She's outlived her grandmother by 3 years. She's the last survivor of a family destroyed by violence and silence. She spent her entire life carrying the weight of an unsolved murder. And now, finally, that weight has shifted. Not disappeared. It will never disappear, but shifted. Because now she knows who killed her grandmother. She knows why the family fell apart. She knows that justice, however delayed, eventually arrived. She speaks about the stigma attached to rape and murder, how people withdrew from her family when they learned what happened, how difficult subjects were avoided, how her mother never recovered. This stigma, this tendency to treat victims' families as somehow tainted compounds, trauma, it isolates people who most need support. Mary's advocacy work now focuses on this. She speaks about cold cases, about the importance of never giving up, about the need to support victims' families, regardless of how much time has passed, about the harm caused by stigma and silence. Louisa Dunn was more than a murder victim. She was a woman who lived 75 years, who married twice and was widowed twice, who raised 2 daughters, who was active in her community and local government, who wore a black velvet coat and walked to the shops every day, who loved gooseberry custard, who said, "Good night, God bless, I don't know when I'll be seeing thee," every time she left a friend's house. She deserved to die peacefully in her sleep at a very old age, surrounded by family who loved her. Instead, she died alone and terrified, in her front room, attacked by a stranger who saw her only as prey. But because of science, determination, and a refusal to let time erase justice, her killer finally faced consequences, 58 years late, but faced them nonetheless. This same failure, the same pattern of elderly people being targeted, attacked, and forgotten is happening right now. There are hundreds of unsolved cases across the UK involving vulnerable victims, cases where evidence sits in boxes, waiting for someone to care enough to revisit them. They're counting on you to watch this, feel sad, and forget by tomorrow. If you believe this kind of injustice needs to end, take 2 seconds and engage. Silence protects predators. Silence enabled Hedley to walk free for 58 years. Silence almost let him die without ever facing consequences. Don't be silent. Like and subscribe right now and share this video, because every share is another person who knows Louisa Dunn's name, another person who believes time doesn't erase accountability, another person standing against the kind of evil that targets the vulnerable. Ryland Hedley is dying in prison. He will never be released. He will never know freedom again, and that happened because people refused to give up. Subscribe if you believe in that kind of persistence. Like, if you believe every victim deserves the same,